The November wind cut across the Nebraska plains like a rusted blade, carrying with it the smell of dying crops and broken dreams. Rowan Mitchell stood in the doorway of his weathered farmhouse, watching dust devils dance across what used to be fertile fields. 43 years old, calloused hands gripping a cup of cold coffee, he looked older than his years. Lines carved deep around his eyes, shoulders permanently bent from decades of work that had yielded less and less with each passing season. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations, 160 acres that his grandfather had sweated blood to pay off. Now, the bank held more claim to it than Rowan did. The drought had stretched into its 3rd year, wells running dry, crops withering before they could be harvested. He'd sold off most of the equipment 6 months ago, kept only what he absolutely needed. His 2 remaining horses had been sold last month. The cattle, gone the year before. A rusted pickup truck rattled up the dirt road, trailing a cloud of dust behind it. Rowan recognized it immediately, Atticus Wheeler, a neighboring farmer who was barely hanging on himself. The truck door groaned as Atticus climbed out, a lean man in his 60s with sun-damaged skin and eyes that had seen too many hard seasons. "Rowan," Atticus nodded, pushing back his sweat-stained hat. "Atticus, didn't expect to see you today." The older man shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Heard you might have some grain left. Animal feed." Rowan's jaw tightened. He had exactly 3 50-pound sacks left in the barn, the last of his stored feed, meant to get him through until whatever came next. "Might have a bit." "I got something to trade," Atticus said, glancing back at the horse trailer hitched to his truck. "Old Workhorse. Belonged to Clayton Harris before he passed. His widow, Marlowe, asked me to find him a home. She's moving to Omaha to live with her daughter." Rowan walked toward the trailer, curiosity overriding his skepticism. Inside stood a dark bay gelding, probably 17 hands high, with a shaggy winter coat that needed brushing. The horse's head hung low, eyes half closed, looking every bit as tired as Rowan felt. His legs were thick and sturdy, built for pulling, not for show. A white star marked his forehead, barely visible beneath his forelock. How old? 14, maybe 15. Clayton had him for 8 years, worked him pretty hard. He's sound, just nobody wants him. Too old for the young folks looking for a project horse, too plain for anyone else. Name's Keaton. Rowan studied the animal. Keaton didn't look like much. His coat was dull, his ribs slightly visible, his overall appearance utterly unremarkable. But there was something in the way the horse suddenly lifted his head and looked directly at Rowan, ears pricked forward with unexpected alertness, that made him pause. "You're offering me this horse for grain?" "1 sack. That's all I'm asking. Marlowe just wants him to have a home where he'll be fed and worked." She said Clayton thought real highly of him, but she can't explain why. Just said the old man was particular about this one. Rowan did the math in his head. 1 sack of grain would feed him and the horse for maybe a month if they were careful. But a workhorse could pull things, could help with the few remaining chores that required strength he no longer had. And truthfully, the loneliness had been eating at him worse than the hunger. The farm felt too empty, too silent. "Deal," Rowan heard himself say. 30 minutes later, Keaton stood in Rowan's small barn, investigating his new surroundings with surprising energy. As Atticus drove away, Rowan poured grain into a bucket, watching the horse eat with methodical efficiency. There was something about the way Keaton moved, a purposefulness that seemed at odds with his worn appearance. "Well, Keaton," Rowan said softly, running a hand down the horse's neck, "welcome to the end of the line. We make a good pair, both of us past our prime, both of us nobody wanted." The horse lifted his head from the bucket and turned to look at Rowan, holding his gaze for a long moment. In that look, Rowan could have sworn he saw something that made no logical sense, recognition, maybe even purpose. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. He was tired, stressed, probably half crazy from the isolation. Horses were just animals, nothing more. But as Rowan left the barn that night, he glanced back to see Keaton standing at the stall door, watching him go with those intelligent eyes, head held high, despite the weariness in his bones. The first week with Keaton passed uneventfully enough. Rowan put the horse to work pulling the small cart he used to haul firewood from the back 40, a section of his land where a few stubborn cottonwoods still stood. The horse worked steadily, never complaining, never balking, but there was an oddness to his behavior that Rowan couldn't quite pinpoint. Every morning, when Rowan let Keaton out into the small paddock beside the barn, the horse would walk the same strange pattern, not grazing randomly like a normal horse, but moving with deliberate steps to specific points, pausing at each one, pawing the ground gently with his front hoof. He'd stand there for several minutes, head lowered, as if listening to something beneath the earth. "What are you doing, old man?" Rowan asked one crisp morning, his breath forming clouds in the December air. He'd been watching this ritual for 5 days straight now, and his curiosity was turning into something more intense. The points Keaton stopped at formed a line, running roughly north to south across the paddock and extending beyond it into the untilled field. That afternoon, while Keaton rested in his stall, Rowan walked the pattern himself, trying to see what the horse saw. The ground looked no different at these spots, just hard-packed earth and dying weeds like everywhere else. But when he knelt down at the third point, he noticed something. The dirt here felt slightly different, less compacted somehow. He dug his fingers in and found the soil was more moist than the surrounding area, despite the drought. Interesting. Over the next few days, Rowan began paying closer attention. He realized that Keaton's behavior wasn't random, it was systematic. The horse seemed to be searching for something, or trying to communicate something. When Rowan tried to lead him away from his pattern, Keaton would pull back insistently, returning to his ritual as soon as he was free. One evening, Rowan's neighbor from the east property line, a woman named Briar Cartwright, who ran a small organic vegetable operation, stopped by with a basket of root vegetables. Potatoes, carrots, turnips. "Thought you could use these," she said simply. Briar was in her mid-50s, weathered and practical, the kind of person who helped without making a fuss about it. "Saw you got Clayton's horse." "Yeah, strange animal." "Clayton was strange too," Briar said, watching Keaton through the barn door. "But smart, real smart. He used to say that horse could find water where the professionals couldn't. Used to hire them out together before the drought got bad. Clayton and Keaton, finding well sites for folks." Rowan's head snapped toward her. "Find water?" "Clayton had a gift for it," people said. "Dowsing, they call it. Water witching. Lot of folks thought it was nonsense, but he had success where others failed. Trained that horse to help him somehow. After Clayton got sick last year, he stopped taking jobs. Marlowe said the cancer took him fast." After Briar left, Rowan stood in the paddock as twilight descended, watching Keaton. The horse was doing his pattern again, but now Rowan understood what he might be looking for. Water, underground water. But this was drought country. The aquifer had dropped 20 feet in the last 5 years. His own well was nearly dry. What could Keaton possibly be finding? That night Rowan barely slept. He kept thinking about those spots where the soil felt different, where Keaton persistently stopped and pawed. In the morning, before sunrise, he went to the barn and found the old geological survey maps his grandfather had kept, detailed charts of the property from the 1950s, showing elevations, soil types, and water table depths from that era. Spreading them out on his kitchen table, he marked the spots where Keaton had been stopping. The line the horse traced didn't correspond to anything obvious on the modern property. But when Rowan overlaid it with the oldest map from 1952, he saw something that made his hands shake. 70 years ago, there had been a natural spring on this property, feeding into a small creek that had long since dried up. The spring's location was marked clearly on the map, and it ran almost exactly along the line Keaton was tracing. Chapter 3. The Old Spring. The December morning arrived cold and clear, frost painting intricate patterns on the farmhouse windows. Rowan had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities that seemed too far-fetched to believe. Still, he'd learned long ago that hope, even unreasonable hope, was sometimes the only thing that kept a man going. He led Keaton out of the barn just after sunrise, the horse's breath steaming in the frigid air. Instead of letting the animal do his usual pattern, Rowan decided to follow his instinct and the old map. He walked Keaton to the furthest point north, where the old survey indicated the spring had once flowed. The moment they reached the spot, an area of his land he'd barely paid attention to in years, overgrown with dead prairie grass and Russian olive bushes, Keaton's entire demeanor changed. The horse's ears shot forward, his head lifted high, and he let out a long, powerful whinny that echoed across the empty fields. He pulled toward a slight depression in the ground, nearly yanking the lead rope from Rowan's cold-numbed fingers. "Easy, easy," Rowan said, but his heart was pounding. He let Keaton pull him forward. The horse stopped at the center of the depression and began pawing insistently, more aggressively than Rowan had ever seen him move. The ground here was different, softer, with that same moisture he'd felt in the paddock, but more pronounced. And there was something else, a very faint smell, mineral and clean, that reminded him of the artesian well he'd visited once as a child at his uncle's place in the sandhills. Rowan tied Keaton to a nearby fence post and walked back to the barn, his mind made up. He grabbed a shovel, one of the few tools he hadn't sold, and returned to the spot. The ground was hard, frozen in places, but he started digging anyway, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his back protesting every movement. 3 feet down, the shovel hit something that wasn't dirt. Rock, he thought at first, but when he cleared away more soil, he found old timber, weathered, dark, almost petrified with age, hand-hewn logs, carefully fitted together. Someone had built something here, something old. Working with renewed energy, Rowan cleared more dirt, revealing what looked like a primitive well casing, the type settlers might have constructed a century ago. The timbers formed a square frame, about 3 feet on each side, descending into darkness. As he worked, water began to seep up around the edges, not much but definitely water, and it was moving upward, not draining down. Keaton watched the entire process, remarkably calm now, as if his job was done. By noon, Rowan had exposed the entire structure. It was indeed an old well, or perhaps a spring house, a protected access point to a natural underground water source. Someone, probably the original homesteaders on this land in the 1800s, had built this to capture and channel the spring water. Over the decades, as the water table dropped and the spring diminished, it had been abandoned and eventually buried under accumulated soil and vegetation. But the spring hadn't completely died. It was still there, deep underground, still flowing weakly. Rowan could see it now, a trickle of crystal-clear water emerging from between rocks at the bottom of the structure, pooling in the ancient basin. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his cell phone, one of his few remaining possessions with any value, and called the county extension office. He needed to know what he was looking at, needed to understand if this was just a trickle or something more. The county geologist, a woman named Eden Thatcher, arrived 3 hours later in a mud-splattered SUV, equipment cases in her back seat. She was young, maybe 30, with an efficient manner and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Mitchell, you said you found an old spring." "That's right. My horse led me to it." Eden raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on the horse part. She spent the next hour testing the water, taking measurements, consulting maps on her tablet, and making notes. Rowan watched her expression shift from professional interest to something more intense. "Mr. Mitchell," she finally said, "do you know what you have here?" Water. Not just water. This is a rare artesian spring, pressurized groundwater from a deep isolated aquifer that's not connected to the regular water table. That's why it's still flowing, despite the drought. The geological formation here suggests you might be tapping into the Ogallala aquifer at a point where it's confined between impermeable rock layers, creating natural pressure. Rowan's mouth went dry. What does that mean, practically speaking? Eden smiled, a real smile that transformed her professional demeanor into something warmer. It means that if we properly develop this spring, drill down, install proper casing, maybe add a windmill pump, you could have a reliable, sustainable water source that won't depend on rain or the dropping water table. This could support crops, livestock, maybe even... Mr. Mitchell, do you know anything about the mineral content of this water? No. She held up a testing strip, its colors clearly showing high mineral content. I'll need to run full lab tests, but based on preliminary readings, this water has high levels of dissolved minerals, calcium, magnesium, trace elements. If the full analysis confirms what I think it does, this isn't just water. This could be bottled and sold as premium mineral water. The market for that is enormous right now. Rowan sat down hard on the cold ground, his legs suddenly unable to support him. Heaton wandered over and nuzzled his shoulder, the horse's warm breath a comfort in the cold air. Winter gave way to an early spring, and Rowan's life transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined 4 months earlier. Eden Thatcher's laboratory analysis had confirmed her suspicions. The spring water contained a unique mineral profile, including trace amounts of lithium, magnesium, and silica in proportions that made it not just drinkable, but potentially valuable for its purported health benefits. More importantly, when they'd properly excavated and tested the spring's flow rate, they discovered it was producing nearly 10 gallons per minute, a rate that, while modest by commercial standards, was remarkably stable and sustainable. The artesian nature of the source meant it required minimal pumping energy. The water pushed itself up naturally. The county's Economic Development Office had connected Rowan with investors interested in agricultural innovation and sustainable water resources. Within 6 weeks, he'd signed agreements that allowed him to retain ownership of his land while partnering with a regional bottling company. The company would build a small-scale bottling facility on a 5-acre section of his property, employing locals and paying Rowan both a land lease and substantial royalties on water extraction. But the water discovery was just the beginning. The publicity around Rowan's miracle spring had attracted attention from an unexpected quarter, a team of archaeologists from the University of Nebraska who wanted to investigate the original well structure he'd uncovered. Professor Silas Brennan, a specialist in frontier history, arrived in late February with 2 graduate students. They spent 3 weeks carefully excavating the area around the old spring house, documenting everything they found. What they discovered rewrote a small piece of Nebraska history. The well structure dated to approximately 1867, built by some of the first homesteaders in the region. But more significantly, they found a buried cache nearby, a sealed iron box containing 23 gold double eagle coins, dated between 1850 and 1865, along with handwritten documents detailing a small but successful freight operation that had run through this area during the post-Civil War period. The homesteader who'd built the spring house had apparently hidden his savings there, perhaps planning to retrieve them later, but never getting the chance. The coins and historical documents were worth approximately $450,000 to collectors. And after legal proceedings to establish clear ownership, the find was awarded to Rowan as the property owner. Now, on a warm April morning, Rowan stood in his pasture, the same pasture that 4 months ago had been nothing but dust and despair, watching as sprinkler systems distributed mineral-rich spring water across newly planted alfalfa. The green was almost painful to look at after years of brown, but it was real. The crop was growing. Keaton grazed nearby, his coat now glossy and healthy, his weight restored. The horse had become something of a local celebrity, featured in news stories about the discovery. Tourists occasionally drove out to take pictures of the horse that found the fortune, though Rowan tried to discourage it. Keaton was just a horse, a very smart, very well-trained horse who'd understood what his former owner had taught him. "Rowan!" a voice called from the driveway. He turned to see Atticus Wheeler walking toward him, a wide grin on his weathered face. "Came to see the miracle farm everyone's talking about." "No miracle," Rowan said, clasping the older man's hand. "Just good luck and a good horse." "Best trade I ever made," Atticus said with a laugh. "One sack of grain for a horse that made you a millionaire." "About that," Rowan said, his expression turning serious, "I've been meaning to talk to you. That grain was worth maybe $15. Keaton was priceless. I know you and Marlowe were just trying to help me, trying to give me something to hold on to. I want to make it right." "Rowan, that's not—" "I'm setting up a fund," Rowan interrupted, "for farmers in the county who are struggling like I was. Interest-free loans, assistance with equipment, help with well drilling for those who need it. I'm putting $500,000 into it to start, and I want you on the advisory board, helping decide who gets help." Atticus's eyes grew suspiciously bright. He looked away toward the horizon, taking a moment to compose himself. "Clayton would have liked that," he finally said. "He always said this land took care of those who took care of it." "There's something else," Rowan added. "Marlowe, is she happy in Omaha?" "Truthfully, I think she misses the farm. She's not a city person. There's a foreman position opening up here. The bottling company wants someone to oversee the agricultural side of operations, someone who knows farming, knows water, knows this land." I immediately thought of her. It comes with a house on the property, good salary, health insurance, if she's interested. That afternoon, Rowan walked out to the spring site, now protected by a simple fence and equipped with proper monitoring equipment. The original stone spring house had been partially restored and preserved as a historical site, a reminder of the people who'd first fought to make this land productive. Keaton followed him, as the horse often did now, no longer tied or led, but simply choosing to stay close. They stood together in the late afternoon sun, looking at the water that bubbled up clear and cold from deep beneath the earth. "You knew, didn't you?" Rowan said softly to the horse. "Clayton taught you to find water, and you remembered. Even after he was gone, you remembered what you were supposed to do." Keaton lowered his head to drink from the spring, the picture of contentment. Rowan thought back to that November day when he'd made the trade, when he'd been so certain he was at the end of everything. He'd been right about one thing. It had been the end of the old life, the one defined by struggle and loss and slow defeat. But it had also been a beginning. Summer arrived with gentle rains that, for the first time in years, didn't come too late to matter. Rowan's farm, officially renamed Hidden Spring Farm at the suggestion of the marketing team from the bottling company, had become a model of sustainable agriculture in the region. The bottling facility, a modest but efficient building designed to blend with the rural landscape, employed 12 people from the surrounding communities. The water, branded as Nebraska Artesian Spring Water, had found a niche market among consumers seeking locally sourced mineral-rich beverages. But the farm remained a farm. Rowan had resisted pressure to turn it into something purely commercial. He still planted crops, still maintained livestock, a small herd of cattle now grazed on lush pastures irrigated by the spring. He'd hired 3 full-time workers, including Marlowe Harris, who'd returned from Omaha with obvious relief and now managed the day-to-day operations with the skill of someone who'd spent a lifetime in agriculture. On a warm July morning, Rowan stood in the barn, brushing Keaton's coat until it shone. The horse was scheduled to make an appearance at the county fair later that day, not as a show animal, but as part of an educational exhibit about water conservation and agricultural history. Rowan had initially resisted the idea, not wanting to exploit the horse, but he'd come to see it differently. Keaton's story could inspire people, could remind them that value wasn't always obvious, that patience and attention could reveal hidden worth. "Mr. Mitchell," a young voice called from the barn entrance. Rowan turned to see a teenage boy, maybe 16, standing awkwardly in the doorway. He was thin, dressed in thrift store clothes, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Can I help you?" "I'm Hunter Clemens. My dad's farm is about 12 miles east. Things are pretty bad there, like how they were here before, I guess. I heard about your assistance fund, but my dad's too proud to apply. I was wondering if maybe you needed help around here. I'm strong, I can work hard. I don't need much pay, just enough to help out at home." Rowan saw himself in this boy's eyes, the desperation, the determination, the exhaustion of carrying burdens too heavy for young shoulders. He set down the brush and walked over, extending his hand. "Hunter, is it? Tell me, what do you know about horses?" "Not much, sir. We had to sell ours 2 years ago." "Well, that's about to change. I need someone to help exercise the horses and maintain the pastures. 20 hours a week to start, $15 an hour. You'll also learn about water management, crop rotation, and sustainable farming practices. Consider it an education and a job combined." The boy's eyes widened. Yes, sir, thank you, sir." "And Hunter, tonight I'm going to visit your father. Not about the job, about some ideas I have for water drilling on his property. The geological survey shows similar formations in his area. Can't promise anything, but it's worth exploring." After the boy left, practically floating with relief and hope, Marlowe appeared from the office, a knowing smile on her face. "You can't save everyone, Rowan." "I'm not trying to save anyone," he replied, returning to Keaton's brushing. "I'm just trying to pass along what was given to me. Clayton gave me this horse. You and Atticus gave me hope when I needed it most. The spring gave me a future. Seems only right to keep that going." "Clayton would have liked you," Marlowe said softly. "He always said the measure of a man wasn't what he had, but what he did when he had it. You're doing him proud." That afternoon at the county fair, Rowan stood beside Keaton's stall in the exhibition barn, fielding questions from curious visitors. Most wanted to know about the discovery, about the gold coins and the spring, and the incredible luck of it all. He answered patiently, but he always steered the conversation back to the real story. The importance of water conservation, the value of preserving agricultural land, the need to support farmers before they reach the breaking point he'd reached. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, approached Keaton carefully. "Is he magic?" she asked, eyes wide. "No, sweetheart," Rowan said gently. "He's just a very smart horse who was trained by a very smart man. The magic, if there is any, is in paying attention, in noticing when something or someone is trying to show you something important." The girl reached up to pat Keaton's nose, and the horse lowered his head obligingly, huffing softly against her small hand. As evening approached and the crowds thinned, Rowan led Keaton back to the trailer for the drive home. Eden Thatcher, who'd become a regular consultant for the farm's water management, met him at the truck. "The geological survey on the Clemens property came back," she said, holding up her tablet. "There's a promising formation about 40 feet down. Not as strong as yours, but enough to make a real difference for them. Probably not commercially viable, but definitely enough for sustainable farming. I've marked the best drilling spots." "Can they afford it?" "With the assistance fund covering half the cost and a payment plan for the rest? Yes. Barely, but yes." Rowan nodded, relief washing over him. "Set it up, and Eden, I want you to start training local drillers in the techniques you used here. Create a program. Teach them how to find and develop small-scale artesian sources. There might be others like mine, waiting to be found. That's a big vision, Rowan. I've got the resources now. Might as well use them for something that matters. That night, back at the farm, Rowan stood in the doorway of the barn, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Keaton stood in his paddock, head high, backlit by the fading light. The horse looked noble now, properly cared for and appreciated. But Rowan remembered that first day, remembered the tired, unremarkable animal no one else had wanted. Value wasn't always obvious. Worth wasn't always apparent on the surface. Sometimes the most important things came disguised as something common, something forgettable, something to overlook in favor of flashier options. He thought about that sack of grain he'd traded, $15 worth of feed for a horse that had changed his entire life. Not because the horse was magic, not because of luck alone, but because Clayton Harris had taken the time to teach an ordinary workhorse an extraordinary skill. Because Atticus and Marlowe had cared enough to find the animal a good home. Because Rowan himself had been desperate enough, lonely enough, to accept a trade that made no practical sense. All those small choices, all those moments of compassion and connection, had woven together into something that looked like a miracle, but was really just the result of people being decent to each other, when they didn't have to be. "Not bad for a worthless workhorse," Rowan said to the night air, a smile playing at his lips. From the paddock, Keaton raised his head and whinnied. A strong, clear sound that carried across the farm, over fields that were green again, past springs that bubbled with life-giving water, through air that smelled like rain and growing things and possibility, the sound of survival, the sound of hope. The sound of a second chance, discovered not by grand plans or brilliant schemes, but by a tired farmer following a patient horse to water.